Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The night smelled of diesel and winter dust when Soviet armor crawled across the Afghan border on Christmas Eve 1979. Helicopter rotors carved cold air above the Hindu Kush, their blades flickering like a warning no one could yet translate. In Kabul, the lights inside the Tajbeg Palace glowed faintly against the dark hills, unaware that a regime was living out its final ordinary minutes. It began not with speeches, but with boots disguised in Afghan uniforms moving silently toward doors they were never meant to enter. Inside the palace, Afghan officers poured tea and argued in low voices about coming raids in Herat. A child near the stairwell coughed from coal smoke seeping through stone vents. The quiet was artificial too perfect, and some guards felt it in their bones. Outside, Soviet Spetsnaz teams tightened gloves and checked watches. They had rehearsed this run on mock buildings in Tashkent and Frunze, but rehearsal never replicates the tremor in your wrist when real walls rise in front of you. When the first flash lit the foyer, the palace erupted with tracer arcs, ricochets, and the brutal percussion of shaped charges on carved stone. Soviet airborne groups swept room to room in a brutal rhythm door grenade muzzle flare. Afghan defenders, already on edge from rumors of poisoning attempts, fought as if each doorway were a homeland. One Soviet diarist would later write of the strange smell burning carpets, stone dust and fear in the air thick enough to chew. Shadowed corridors turned into killboxes, stairwells jammed with spent shells. The palace moments ago, a symbol became an anatomy of panic. When Hafizullah Amin was cornered near the upper landing, his final words drowned beneath automatic fire and broken plaster. By dawn, Soviet command trucks idled outside ministries, still warm with the smell of carbon and cordite. Inside radio rooms, new orders pulsed through telephone lines whose operators were too shocked to breathe. Soviet advisors reconnected circuits, broadcast emergency announcements, and installed Babrak Karmal under the lens of studio lights. Official language framed the operation as protective assistance, though the broken bodies in the palace courtyard said otherwise. Outside Kabul, shepherds on dawn ridgelines traced columns of smoke rising from the capital and whispered that the old world had snapped. On paper, the strike was flawless decapitation, warfare executed with surgical speed. But even the best scalpels cut deeper than intended. The people who had watched kings fall and empires bleed now watched armored personnel carriers push through narrow roads and wondered why foreign uniforms were back on Afghan soil. The Soviets believed that killing ahead ended the movement. They did not know Afghanistan's resistance did not grow from palaces, but from mountains, faith, and clan memory. As the capital trembled, distant valleys stiffened. Villagers who had never owned radios already knew what had happened. In the mountains above Panjshir, a young fighter named Salim climbed a ridge and watched helicopters draw silver arcs against the horizon. The wind tugged his scarf like a prophet's sleeve. He whispered to his cousin, "They have the sky." His cousin replied, "Then we will own the ground." Below, convoys lengthened into thin lines vulnerable to rock and gravity. More important than the bodies on the palace floor was the invisible wound inflicted on morale, both Soviet and Afghan. Symbols matter. Symbols bleed slow. When the palace lights finally flickered out, Kabul exhaled like a city punched in the lungs. But in alleyway tea houses, old men shook their heads as if reading a familiar script. They had seen armies come with polished boots and leave with torn soles. The Soviets had removed a leader, but they had not removed the terrain, the clans, the belief that no empire can hold a mountain by decree. The first engines of resistance warmed in silence, hidden behind market stalls and inside tribal tents. The last gunshot from Tajbeg Palace echoed down the stone slopes. It rolled across the valley like a warning, bounced between ridges, and dissolved into cold air. That single fading crack would be remembered long after flags changed and borders blurred, because it marked the moment the war stopped being about a government and became a contest between mountains and machines. At dawn, the Hindu Kush revealed its true allegiance. Pale sunlight slipped across jagged ridgelines, turning frozen scree into glass and narrow roads into exposed arteries. Soviet armored columns crawled through switchbacks that curved like a scimitar. What looked like terrain on maps became architecture in motion funnels. choke points, blind bends places where machine power could not turn without permission from stone. Pilots squinted from cockpit canopies, tracing spirals of dust rising from convoys below. They knew instinctively this country would not be conquered by flat doctrine. In Panjshir Valley, the rock walls rose so steep and close that engine noise bounced back louder than it left. Soviet drivers hated that echo. It announced their presence 3 bends before anyone could see them. On the ridges, boys quietly counted the seconds between echoes to estimate the convoy's length. Mujahideen commanders studied those curves like mathematicians marking ambush nodes where vehicles bunched and where no turret could elevate enough to fire. They planted mines not on roads, but where trucks would swerve to avoid potholes. These were not random attacks, they were geometry sharpened by generations. Inside a lead BTR corporal, Leonov chewed stale black bread and stared at a cliff face 2 meters off his window. He felt eyes on him, though he saw no one. The radio crackled with old instructions: maintain spacing, maintain vigilance, maintain speed. But the mountains robbed spacing, killed visibility, and forced a crawl. With every slow turn, the convoy forgot about Kabul's palace and thought only of where the next rock slide might conceal something metallic. Leonov closed his eyes and imagined open plains. When he opened them, the cliffs leaned closer. The Mujahideen called this kind of ground the saddle. 2 ridges pinched the road, turning 3 vectors of fire into one. A single RPG hit in the right axle locked the entire column behind it. Fighters would slip down from goat paths, their sandals quiet against gravel. They favored burst fire, not full magazines, clean, controlled like flicking switches. They carried extra water instead of extra ammo. In mountains, thirst kills faster than bullets. Once contact was made, they vanished not backward, but sideways into vertical corridors only they knew. To Soviets, it was retreat. To them, it was repositioning. Helicopters answered. Mi-24 gunships thundered above ridge lines, hunting for muzzle flash glints. But the air itself betrayed them. Thin mountain oxygen strained turbines, dragging rotor RPM under load. Pilots had to climb higher, which widened their attack angles, and left blind pockets of air tucked into rock folds. Massoud's fighters positioned themselves in those folds, the places where physics built shadows. They learned to fire after the gunship passed overhead, not before. Timing turned altitude into liability. Maps in Soviet command tents showed roads as clean blue lines, arteries connecting cities like organs. But Afghan fighters saw the opposite. Every artery was a noose, every bend a potential clot. When Soviet planners tried to predict ambush sites, they underestimated an unwritten rule: villagers never built roads where men traveled. The real paths threaded behind orchards, through dry riverbeds, and across talus fields at angles too sharp for tracked vehicles. Supply officers soon discovered that logistics were slower than stories. Rumor outran fuel. Down in the valley near Gulbahar, a mechanic hammered the dented fender of a gas truck and muttered to himself. He had replaced the same axle 3 times because the road forced the same pivot stress over and over. On the ridge above, old shepherds chuckled and sipped tea. They had memorized each pivot decades before. One elder tapped his cane against the dust and said softly, "Mountains teach. If you do not learn, they bury." No one wrote it down. They didn't need to. In the evenings, after convoys limped into camp, soldiers scrubbed rock dust from their teeth and ears. The diesel taste lingered like regret. Letters home mentioned cold boredom and mountains that never blinked. No one mentioned fear, but commas stretched longer between phrases. Outside the wire, a muezzin's call rose from a hidden village echoing across stone. Soviet guards lifted binoculars toward the dark. They wanted shapes. The mountains gave them only silhouettes. The palace strike had been swift and decisive, but here among cliffs and switchbacks, the war began to lose its clean corners. The Soviets realized they could seize cities, but not the spaces between them. The Mujahideen understood the spaces were all that mattered, and as convoys coiled through another dawn's funnel, the mountains waited patient, ancient, indifferent to flags. By winter's end, Soviet commanders began to fear silence more than gunfire. The quiet along mountain roads was never empty. It was a held breath, the pause between footsteps in a hunter's gait. Convoys wound through gullies with cliffs rising like butchers' walls above them. Here artillery couldn't angle, and turret elevation met stone. Mujahideen fighters learned to count engine rhythms, watching for the moment when a tank had to downshift when momentum stalled and weight shifted awkwardly. War was not won by strength, but by timing. A standard Soviet patrol might see nothing at first, children selling flatbread, a shepherd waving from a ridge. Then abruptly, the world snapped. The first RPG round always struck the third or fourth vehicle, not the lead. It wasn't meant to kill the convoy. It was meant to stop it. When metal screamed and rubber burned, trucks bunched together, forming a perfect L-shaped killbox pinned between rock and wreckage. Machine guns opened from two angles, creating a diagonal crossfire. Mujahideen didn't fire continuously. They pulsed their bursts, forcing soldiers to duck reflexively, shaving seconds off Soviet reaction time. Corporal Leonov dove behind a wheel, well heart hammering against bone. He had been briefed about these ambushes, but briefings never mentioned the sound, the high whine of ricochets skimming rock like angry bees, or the thump of boots along hidden switchbacks above. Dust hung in the air, thick and granular, blurring the edges of things. He shouted for a medic, but the only answer was another grenade clinking onto corrugated metal. Some men swore, others prayed. Most simply held their breath. The ambush choreography was simple and cruel. A heavy shooter RPG or captured recoilless rifle opened first to pin. Light machine guns stitched the column midsection to prevent breakout. A third team cut the rear, blocking retreat. The exit route wasn't behind, but up narrow goat paths that Soviet boots couldn't climb. Mujahideen disappeared into altitudes where pursuit meant oxygen loss and rotor fatigue. The Soviets often called these vanishing trails ghost escapes, but there was nothing supernatural about them, just geography inherited like family names. Soviet doctrine encouraged counter-assaults into ambushes, but the cliffs mocked doctrine. When armored vehicles tried to push forward, the road narrowed into a bottleneck that turned armor into targets. When infantry tried to flank the slopes, forced them to crawl at awkward diagonals, exposing their chests. Worse, the ambush rarely lasted more than 8 minutes. By the time reinforcements arrived, fighters were shadows retreating along ridges, their footprints indistinguishable from goat tracks. The Mujahideen didn't aim to wipe out units. They aimed to bleed confidence. In a small village overlooking the valley, an old man poured tea with steady hands. He'd heard the distant cracking and watched dust plumes rise. "They fight like ghosts," his grandson whispered. The elder shook his head softly. "Ghosts do not choose when to be seen. These men choose." Behind the family's courtyard wall lay a cache wrapped in burlap, 3 rifles, 1 RPG tube, and boxes of ammunition buried long before the Soviets arrived. In Afghanistan, preparation was older than politics. Military analysts in Kabul blamed low-discipline terrain, unfamiliarity, or insurgent fanaticism. They refused to consider a simpler truth: the ambush was not a desperate tactic. It was a design. Each guerrilla cell rehearsed withdrawal angles, aiming lanes, and fallback timing. Their watches weren't synchronized by radio, but by habit and echo. When a Soviet soldier breathed relief after surviving an ambush, he didn't realize relief itself was the weapon. Sleep would be thinner tonight, trust weaker tomorrow. Trucks burned until late dusk, their flames licking ridge faces. The smoke drifted up the valley in layers, carrying the metallic smell of fuel and cordite. Helicopters circled, but could see nothing through the updrafts. One pilot scribbled in his log, "They disappear sideways into the mountain. We chase up. Wrong direction." Down below, soldiers shoveled burnt debris off the road, muttering curses into scarves. They didn't know the Mujahideen watched from a ridge, counting how many shovels moved, estimating losses with morbid accuracy. As the column prepared to move again, men waved away smoke and tightened straps. Engines sputtered to life, exhausted. The forward commander radioed in minor losses, road clear proceeding east. But the truth lingered on every face: the road was not clear. It was merely resumed, and tomorrow the mountains would choreograph another cut. When Soviet staff officers lectured about Afghanistan, they pointed to cities like gemstones on a map: Kabul, Kandahar, Herat. On paper, holding them meant victory. But the blank space between those points, the veins of supply and fuel moving through narrow roads, was where the war truly lived. Mujahideen commanders understood that tanks consume fuel, helicopters consume maintenance, soldiers consume sleep. They didn't need to destroy armies, they only needed to starve arteries. In mountain warfare, logistics are not support, they are vulnerability. The Soviet motor pool smelled of diesel grease and quiet desperation. Mechanics hammered bent axles with dull mallets, cursing the way mountain roads twisted vehicles into metal fatigue. Transport officers tracked fuel like blood rationing more carefully than ammunition. A single blown truck on a high pass forced convoys to idle for hours, burning precious liters. Mujahideen scouts waited for that idle heat plumes, rising engines, panting men exposed under cliffs. They learned a time harassment when the mountain already had its knee on the Soviet throat. In Wardak province, fighters stalked convoys like wolves, focusing not on frontline armor, but the slow-moving tenders' fuel trucks, water carriers' mobile repair platforms. An RPG round into a tanker didn't just kill it, ignited a rolling firestorm that devoured the column's future. Road workers spent days clearing melted asphalt, and helicopters hovered nervously overhead, their rotors kicking grit into open wounds. Soviet soldiers called those burning tankers red candles, ill-omened flames, visible for kilometers announcing failure to anyone watching. For every liter of fuel burned by a helicopter, another truck somewhere had to crawl through a choke point to replace it. Mujahideen planted mines not where vehicles drove, but where they would have to swerve into softer shoulders that collapsed under weight. A major's field notebook scribbled, "The road itself is enemy." On ridges, children passed coded signals, mirror flashes, fabric on sticks, warning ambush teams when convoys stretched too thin or bunched too tight. Hospitality doubled as reconnaissance. Tea kettles brewed intelligence. Supply depots became forts ringed with wire and tension. And some soldiers spent more time guarding crates than firing weapons. When night fell, distant cracks from unseen rifles forced gunners to scan darkness until their eyes throbbed. Sleep frayed at the edges. A young conscript wrote home that silence tasted metallic, like he'd swallowed pennies. Another described the moonlit silhouettes of oil drums lined up like execution victims. Logistics hubs did not smell like victory, they smelled like things dying slowly. Mujahideen squads didn't linger after raids. They melted into orchards, ravines, dry riverbeds, places where tracked vehicles sank and infantry sweated blood. They planted booby traps along predictable Soviet recovery routes. Explosive charges wired to trip lines on likely tow points turned repair missions into nightmares. Engineers began to pray under their breath. Each time they reached for a broken axle, they pictured a wire beneath the dust. Fear multiplied the cost of every repair. To counter this bleed, the Soviets built heavily escorted convoys, columns bristling with armored vehicles and helicopters overhead. But weight was not deterrence. It was drag. More trucks meant longer lines. Longer lines meant lower pace. Lower pace meant more time in kill zones. Mujahideen commanders smiled invisibly. In their doctrine, the enemy helped you if you waited long enough. They did not need to outrun tanks. They only needed to outrun patience. In one remote valley, a lone Soviet supply truck stalled on a rocky incline. The driver cursed as his transmission slipped, tires spinning. Minutes later, muffled shots cracked from above. A bullet glanced off the hood, another pierced the radiator. Steam hissed into the cold air, marking the truck like a distressed animal. The support vehicle behind could not maneuver around it. The column stalled. Men ran to take positions, hearts sinking. Somewhere unseen, a young guerrilla whispered, "Hold them here. Let time do the killing." Helicopters answered again, strafing ridges with cannon fire. But fuel consumption spiked and maintenance crews worked until fingers bled. Mountain dust chewed rotor blades, clogging filters, grinding bearings. The Soviets had technology, but Afghanistan had geology, and geology doesn't negotiate. By spring, battalion logs recorded more grounded helicopters from where than from Mujahideen fire. Logistics officers stopped sleeping. They knew a quiet day meant a bad week coming. As columns limped into another dusty cantonment truck, hatches squealed like wounded animals. Crewmen slumped from cabins, eyes-rimmed red uniforms, stiff with sweat and dust. They ate ration bread that tasted like gasoline from handling fuel lines. Letters home mentioned that supply was worse than combat because at least combat had purpose. Logistics was death by decimals. Up on a distant ridge, 3 guerrillas sipped hot tea from chipped cups and watched the last trucks roll under them. One leaned back against warm rock, smiling. "We do not cut throats," he murmured. "We cut breath." The rock absorbed his voice and held it. The Soviets controlled cities. The Mujahideen controlled the veins between them, and slowly, methodically, those veins tightened. By midsummer, Soviet soldiers began to dread the dark more than daylight ambushes. The night was where the war whispered instead of shouted. In outposts perched along valley floors, perimeter lights buzzed like tired insects. Men stared across open gravel fields, waiting for shapes that never fully formed. Mujahideen fighters learned that bullets were not the only weapon wakefulness could kill too. A soldier who slept 5 fractured hours across a week fought like a man underwater. The harassment always began the same way: a single distant crack, too far to localize, too loud to ignore. Then silence thickened like oil. Guards held breath behind sandbags, fingers hovering above triggers. Minutes later, another crack, different angle, different distance. It wasn't meant to hit. It was meant to put the base on alert cycling adrenaline until it curdled. When the pattern repeated for hours, hearts and hands trembled. After 2 weeks of this, even-seasoned sergeants jumped at the snap of a twig. Inside the barracks, Corporal Leonov lay on his cot, watching dust drift through a beam of moonlight. Each time his eyes sagged shut, gunfire stitched through the valley, waking everyone. He whispered a curse he'd never used outside dreams. Across the room, a radio operator scribbled in his journal, "It feels like the dark watches us." A chipped enamel mug rattled on a metal shelf with every distant concussion, as if tiny earthquakes shook the ribs of the barracks. The Mujahideen rotated harassment teams with surgical precision. They fired a handful of single shots from a ridge, then moved laterally 1/2 kilometer and fired again. No 2 angles repeated. It forced Soviet mortars to waste rounds into empty rock. Spotters used old British field glasses passed down from ancestors who had fought other empires. Once the Soviets triangulated a position, the shooters already sipped tea in a different ravine. War by insomnia was cheap, quiet, and cruel. Psychological bleed spread inside men like frostbite. Commanders reported increased arguments over trivial directives, slowed reaction time, and jumpy trigger discipline. The edges of discipline frayed. A quartermaster accidentally fired his rifle into a supply crate after a door slammed. A cook fainted because he misheard a pot clang as a grenade. Sleep deprivation is invisible at first, then it becomes louder than artillery. Patrols sent into the night returned hollow-eyed, clutching weapons like talismans. They found nothing but footprints leading nowhere, goat prints mostly. The mountains disguised intent well. On some nights, guerrillas detonated small charges on ridges simply to echo thunder into tents. On others, they played recordings of amplified footsteps across valleys to suggest larger forces. A Soviet lieutenant wrote home, "It's not what we see. It's what we think we see." The Soviets responded by installing floodlights around bases, washing the perimeters in harsh white glare. But the glare created blind spots, silhouetting movement inside while obscuring shapes beyond the wire. Mujahideen shooters used those angles to aim at men outlined perfectly like targets on a training range. The lights meant to protect instead branded. After a week, mechanics removed bulbs one by one, muttering that the dark was kinder than the glow. Sleep-starved gunners began to call every shadow an ambush. Friendly patrols returning late endured accidental fire from jumpy comrades. Medical units saw spikes in ulcers, hypertension, tremors. One medic whispered, "Our bodies think they're dying slow." In Kabul, Soviet doctors prescribed sedatives, but commanders refused their use near the front. A sedated soldier in the wrong minute could doom a platoon. Meanwhile, in a village hidden by orchard smoke, a boy watched his uncle pack ammunition into worn satchels. "Why so few rounds?" he asked. The uncle smiled, tapping the boy's chest. "It is not bullets that break them. It is the hours between them." The boy nodded, absorbing a lesson older than textbooks. A week later, a Soviet outpost endured 27 separate cracks of rifle fire, none of which struck flesh. At dawn, 2 conscripts fell asleep standing up. Mortar crews misread coordinates, dropping rounds short. A commander scolded them, but his voice wavered. He too had slept barely 2 hours. The war wasn't wearing down muscles, it was sanding away judgment, and judgment collapses armies. Eventually the harassment would quiet briefly, leaving silence so sudden it rang in the ears. Soldiers collapsed onto bunks, grateful. The Mujahideen waited 30 minutes, then fired again. The betrayal of rest was more painful than the shots. In some barracks, men swore they would rather face daytime ambushes than another sleepless night. Fatigue made courage thin. One evening, Corporal Leonov folded a torn letter from home. Lines blurred from sand and sweat. "Sleep well whenever you can," his mother wrote. He stared at the words until they became meaningless shapes. Outside, the valley breathed wind through stones. A single shot cracked against the dark. Leonov did not flinch. He only exhaled a long, tired breath that sounded almost like surrender. In Afghanistan, intelligence did not flow through radios or encrypted channels. It traveled in steam rising from teacups and quiet nods, exchanged in crowded markets, in the pause before a shepherd answered a question. Soviet commanders assumed that resistance leadership lived in mountains, but the truth ran deeper. The real network lived in kitchens, mosques, orchard lanes, and guest rooms where carpets softened footsteps. Every village had its own radar hospitality, and hospitality never forgot a face. When a Soviet convoy passed through a valley, children scattered not in fear but in routine. One boy would climb a walnut tree and flash a scrap of mirror toward a distant ridge. Another would run behind a donkey cart pretending to play. An old man stirred a pot of lamb stew outside his compound, adjusting his stirring motion to signal convoy length, heavy vehicles, and turret orientation. None of these acts looked like espionage. They looked like living. That was the point. Inside tea houses, men spoke softly, under the rattle of porcelain cups. They didn't name units, they described boots with rubber soles, foreign engine smoke, new helmets with darker paint. A mullah might mention supplies arriving at dawn only once, as if commenting on weather. The message would travel via layers of kinship, not rank. By the time a Mujahideen commander heard it, he didn't hear rumor, he heard coordinates hidden in metaphor. Across valleys, cousins spoke in riddles that decoded into artillery ranges. Corporal Leonov noticed the staring first. When his platoon marched through a bazaar, merchants didn't recoil, they studied. Eyes flicked to tire wear barrel soot radio antenna length. To the untrained, it looked like curiosity. But each detail measured how long a unit had been in theater, how well it maintained equipment, how fatigued men marched. Resistance fighters didn't need satellite photos. They had butchers, carpenters, and shepherds looking for the same details they'd once used to judge livestock health. The true power of the hospitality network was its deniability. A woman offering bread could note how many soldiers accepted. A boy herding goats could map minefields by watching where engineers hesitated. When Soviet officers attempted to interrogate villagers, they met shrugs and warm smiles. Hospitality in Afghanistan was sacred, older than any ideology. Breaking it meant igniting tribal honor, which even empires avoided. Villagers wore politeness like armor. Even the flow of weddings became coded. When drums echoed late into the night from a nearby village, Soviet troops relaxed. They assumed celebration, but wedding drums masked the sound of fighters assembling. Under the cover of bright fabrics and firelight, commanders swapped messages between bites of pilaf. A single absent cousin at a feast signaled that fighters should reposition along the southern ridge. A missing goat in the morning meant the convoy might split at the next fork. Spies never wrote anything down. Culture wrote everything. Soviet radio operators complained that the enemy always seemed 1 hour ahead. Convoys entered valleys moments after IED teams withdrew. Helicopters landed just after fighters repositioned. Fresh graves appeared, though no shots had been heard. Intelligence officers demanded sources, diagrams, intercepts. But Afghan intelligence moved through relationships, not wires. The command structure of the Mujahideen was not linear, it was circular. Kill a leader, and the circle flowed around the absence like water around stone. In Logar province, a dinner guest leaned casually against a doorway as he listened to Soviet armor echo off the hills. Between bites of lamb, he murmured distances into his beard. A cousin at the feast tied his turban one loop tighter, a signal to his nephew in the corner. 10 minutes later, 3 boys slipped outside carrying baskets of pomegranates. They delivered the fruit to a neighboring village. Beneath each basket lay rolled scraps of cloth and dried fig stems arranged in patterns, a code so old no occupying power had ever cracked it. The message, convoy, north route, slow. At a remote outpost, Leonov studied a plate of rice left anonymously by villagers at the gate. The grains had been arranged oddly, a crooked line down the center. The lieutenant laughed it off as sloppiness, but a local interpreter stiffened the arrangement, suggested road divides a warning. That night, the platoon walked into an L-shaped ambush exactly where the rice had pointed. Hospitality turned omnipresent. Soldiers smiled uneasily whenever strangers offered water, as if every gesture hid intent. They weren't wrong. A hostess could observe thirst levels to calculate how long a patrol had marched. A baker could gauge ration strain by how eagerly soldiers bought bread. When Soviet supply faltered, merchants raised prices, accordingly pushing desperation outward until fighters smelled weakness. No encryption machine ever rivaled gossip. No surveillance drone matched the eyes of mothers bartering in markets. No reconnaissance plane saw what shepherds noticed when dust settled differently on grass. Western analysts would later call it informal intelligence architecture. Afghans called it neighboring. One evening, as Leonov tended a small cooking flame, he heard singing drifting from a distant village. The melody was beautiful, soft, rising like prayer. His interpreter frowned. The song mentioned a river by name. It sounded harmless, but river names in certain verses marked directions. When the final line shifted pitch, the interpreter whispered, "They're moving fighters south." Leonov stared across the dark, suddenly aware that the valley wasn't silent. It was speaking. In a war of satellites and war rooms, the Mujahideen had a simpler doctrine. Soldiers come and go, but neighbors stay. The Soviets controlled checkpoints. The villagers controlled time. And time whispered across teacups was undefeated. For a time, the Soviets believed the sky was theirs. May 24. Hind gunships prowled above the valleys like armored hornets, their cannons stitching the slopes and sending fighters scattering into shadows. From the ground, the gunships looked invincible hulking fuselages, armored glass rotors, roaring like thunder. They were flying fortresses in a land of rifles. Mujahideen called them Shaitan's chariots. In early years, whenever the distinctive twin rotors echoed across rock, men crouched and prayed. But mountains are patient. They watched the helicopters hunt and whispered weaknesses to anyone who listened. Thin air at altitude strained engines, robbed lift, and forced pilots to fly predictable paths along valley floors. Hot exhaust plumes lingered in narrow canyon walls, marking routes like glowing invitation signs. The Mujahideen learned to map these plumes where they cooled, where they hung, where they rose. Geometry again, but vertical this time. One pilot, Major Barishev, wrote in his flight journal, "It feels like the mountains breathe around us. They inhale our rotors, exhale warning echoes." The entry ended abruptly after a rough landing. Maintenance crews discovered pitted rotors coated in talcum-fine dust. Afghanistan's earth was eating the helicopters from the inside. Filters clogged, bearings screamed, fuel consumption spiked. The Soviets did not fear bullets, yet they feared the grind. Then in 1986, the Stinger arrived. The missile was small enough to carry on a shoulder light enough to run with, and simple enough for villagers to learn in one afternoon. It locked onto heat, not sound. When the first Mi-24 fell, its tail snapped like a wing of tin and plunged into a ravine in Panjshir. The debris burned for 6 hours. Soviet pilots swore the smoke twisted upward like a warning finger. For the first time, gunships were ashamed of the open sky. Mujahideen training for Stingers was ritualistic. Fighters practiced tracking rotor signatures by ear before ever touching a launcher. They learned to wait until the helicopter banked slightly, when tail exhaust exposed a clean heat plume. They timed their shots for the descent, where gravity added fatal velocity. If the enemy flew low, mountains amplified the heat signature. If the enemy flew high, blades thinned, lift forcing sluggish maneuvers. The missiles punished both choices. Helicopters adapted by flying higher, but altitude turned their cannons into guesswork. Their rockets missed by dozens of meters. Soviet doctrine had no clause for losing the sky in a landlocked war. Pilots began to fly faster, reducing their time exposed to heat lock. But faster flight meant fewer scouting passes, fewer support runs, fewer eyes protecting convoys. Infantry squads down valley felt the absence like a missing limb. Corporal Leonov patrolling along a ridgeline felt the shift too, before Stinger's air support arrived in minutes. After Stinger's requests came with long silences. Officers told units to rely more on artillery maps, less on pilots' eyes. But maps don't see ambush trails. When resupply trucks smashed into mines, the men cursed at heaven knowing help hovered far above, too afraid to descend. The Mujahideen didn't waste missiles. They fired sparingly, waiting for critical targets, command helicopters, medevacs, troop carriers. When a medevac went down, morale plummeted. Soldiers dreaded injury more than death. Injury meant waiting in pain for aid that might never arrive. The psychological blade cut deeper than the shrapnel. In the ruins of a crashed helicopter, a fighter found a pilot's notebook. It held coordinates notes about wind sketches of ridges with danger arrows. In the margin, "They can hear us in the stone." The fighter closed the notebook, whispering something like respect. War taught both sides humility. Helicopter crews adopted evasive maneuvers, zigzagging through valleys, hugging ridge faces, cutting throttle before cresting saddles. But each maneuver consumed precious fuel. Mechanics worked with cracked knuckles, replacing filters clogged with dust resembling ground bone. Soviet engineers requested new parts faster than factories produced them. Logistics officers saw their ledgers bleed. Eventually, Soviet command restricted helicopter use to critical missions only. This meant fewer reconnaissance sweeps, fewer medevacs, fewer rapid reactions. Ground units began to move slower, more blind. The mountains smiled. One dusk, Leonov watched a Mi-24 rise into amber light. Its rotors chopped the sun into flickering discs shimmering across his helmet. A moment later, a white trail arced upward from a hidden ravine. The helicopter banked, flared, and spun like a lit match in wind. When it hit the rocks, dust rose in a silent column. The explosion came seconds later, too late to matter. In his next letter, Leonov wrote, "The air feels smaller now." His handwriting trembled. The Soviets had walked into Afghanistan believing altitude would give them dominance. But the mountains were never neutral. They leaned toward whoever learned them faster. And with every downed helicopter, the sky shrank another inch. By the war's midpoint, the ground itself became hostile. What looked like ordinary soil hid miniature decisions of life and death. Soviet patrols learned to distrust smooth earth, loose gravel, even friendly paths. Mujahideen fighters planted mines like farmers planting seeds placed with memory, not maps. They understood where boots would naturally step, where vehicles would swerve, where engineers would kneel. Terrain became a field of buried teeth. Simple mines evolved into layered traps. A common setup placed an anti-tank mine on the obvious line of travel. When engineers detected it and moved to clear the path, an anti-personnel mine waited just outside the safe zone where a man would crouch to work. Some devices detonated seconds after pressure released, catching medics rushing to help. Others were buried under dead brush bundles, the edges singed to suggest old burn marks. The Soviets called these ghost routes. They were anything but accidental. Corporal Leonov stepped carefully along a rocky slope, sweat freezing against his spine. He watched the man ahead prod the dirt with a metal rod, listening through the rod. Instead of the headphones, vibrations carried better through bone than wire in mountain air. A second engineer tapped the ground 3 times with his boot heel, checking density. Local fighters had learned to disguise mines under compacted soil that mimicked hard rock. When metal detectors passed, silent men sighed, relieved. That's when the pressure plates claimed them. Mujahideen tacticians became connoisseurs of fear. They knew a single mine outside a base gate made every patrol gingerly slow for weeks. They placed decoys, empty casings filled with sand to waste valuable detection hours. They scattered wires leading to nothing. They buried hollow metal cans to produce false detector tones. In warfare, confusion multiplies faster than explosives. The Soviets responded with mine roller trucks' caged wheels designed to detonate charges ahead of the vehicle. But these rollers were heavy, slow, and obvious. Fighters aimed RPGs at the rollers themselves. When destroyed, a convoy was forced to halt, sending soldiers crawling on hands and knees, prodding earth like blind men. Helicopters hovered overhead, but dust clouds obscured everything. The sky could watch, but not save. In Ghazni, an entire platoon grew paranoid. They began avoiding the main road, moving into dry stream beds instead. Fighters anticipated this, lacing the stream bed with wooden mines undetectable to metal scanners. When the first blast sounded, the second was timed to detonate just as soldiers scrambled uphill. A young grenadier cried out as shrapnel tore his thigh. Medics rushed, then froze, seeing thin wires emerging from stones like veins. They pulled back, leaving him screaming. Mountains swallowed his voice. Local villagers contributed with eerie subtlety. They guided Soviet engineers toward the clean path with smiles and gestures. That path had been seeded for days. They guided Mujahideen around it in dusk and fog. In Afghanistan, the gesture of pointing carried its own dialect. A palm turned flat meant safety. 2 fingers pointed downward meant traps near the roots. Outsiders misread everything. Checkpoints became nightmares. Soldiers slapped dust from their boots before entering tents. Some refused to walk on grass, claiming mines hid beneath cool blades. They hauled planks of wood to distribute weight across uncertain patches. The simple act of stepping became an argument with the ground. Sleep-deprived men stumbled, and the earth answered with fire. Mujahideen sappers, quiet men, with patient eyes, crafted IEDs from Soviet artillery shells, British leftovers, even unexploded ordnance from forgotten wars. They dug shallow graves for their devices, burying them with religious care. They avoided symmetry. Humans detect patterns. They placed mines where goats never stepped because goats sensed death in the soil. Soldiers began watching livestock behavior more than maps. When goats refused a path, squads halted immediately. Night only sharpened the terror. Lantern light twisted shadows, turning rock edges into silhouettes. Engineers tied twine around their ankles and looped it behind teammates if they tripped. The pull signaled danger faster than voices. Still explosives seeded months before woke without warning. Old mines aged like wine, less predictable, more cruel. In an abandoned orchard near Kost Leonov, found a rusted can with a string tied around it. Children had played kick the can years ago. Now the can was filled with nails buried beneath transplanted grass. When a squad marched through, the nails tore flesh and boot leather. It wasn't lethal, but it slowed movement, bled morale, and forced evacuation. For the Mujahideen, slowing was winning. If one mine killed a man, the fighters nodded. Good. If one mine stopped a convoy for an hour, they smiled. Better. If fear of mines forced the Soviets to avoid entire provinces, they laughed softly. Perfect. Mountains did not need to kill anyone. They only needed to persuade soldiers that every step might be the last. At sunset, as Leonov gazed over the valley, his sergeant whispered, "This ground doesn't want us." The wind answered by lifting dust from a forgotten crater, swirling it into the air like smoke from a candle. Below, unseen eyes observed footprints along the ridge, marking where tomorrow's mines would bloom. When Soviet generals searched for the leader of the insurgency, they searched in vain. They imagined a single headquarters, a central council, a mastermind whose removal would collapse resistance. They brought maps to war, beautiful maps with arrows and timetables. But they were fighting a culture built on lineage, not lines. Afghanistan did not give them one head to cut. It offered many necks, and each one grew thicker when another fell. Mujahideen groups operated like strands braided through blood and marriage. Leaders inherited trust, not from titles, but from feasts, attended debts, honored, and roads remembered since childhood. A village smith might command a valley because he fixed rifles and shoes with equal skill. A mullah might direct fighters with 2 whispered sentences during prayer. Tribal networks pulsed like nervous systems. Signal traveled whether Moscow approved or not. Corporal Leonov noticed the pattern whenever patrols returned to base. Every ambush involved fighters who seemed intimately familiar with the ground, who hid behind that rock, who sprinted across that talus field without sliding, who vanished into apricot orchards like smoke. They weren't guided by radio, they were guided by childhood. A land fought by memory is not easily mapped. Attempts to bribe or intimidate village elders worked briefly until another tribe absorbed responsibility. The Soviets would pour aid into one valley only to discover fighters operating from the next ridge supplied by cousins. Kill a commander, and his nephew inherited the rifle and followers. Destroy a mountain village and families scattered into 10 others, widening the net. Every tactical victory fractured into strategic multiplication. Tribal mobility was fluid. Fighters rotated through valleys seasonally following water livestock and rumor. They slept in caves above the snow line in summer, then descended into orchards when cold bit. Soviet troops couldn't predict them because their patterns followed older rhythms, migration, harvest, prayer. When foreign intelligence analysts examined troop movement charts, they thought the resistance was disorganized. Locals saw choreography. Unlike Soviet divisions, Mujahideen bands were modular. A base cell might be 10 fighters, all cousins. They expanded by kinship rather than recruitment posters. When additional rifles were needed, Allied clans lent fighters the way farmers lend tools. No central body issued orders. Consensus moved like wind across a wheat field. When a valley needed defense, a dozen cells arrived before any radio transmission. When danger faded, they melted away again, laughing at the idea of front lines. Meanwhile, Soviet units relied on fixed bases, static points tethered to supply lines. Fighters circled them like wolves around tethered goats, nibbling at isolation, sniffing for weakness. Soviet manuals emphasized perimeter defense. Mujahideen doctrine emphasized perimeter denial. For every base the Soviets built, the fighters gained a new beacon to calibrate their routes and ambush geometry. In one district, a Soviet major attempted to eliminate resistance by inviting all tribal elders to a council. He offered roads, schools, wells. Hours after they accepted tea, 5 separate valleys erupted in sabotage. It wasn't betrayal, it was distribution. Each elder returned to his network. Each network dissolved the bribe like sugar in boiling tea. Tribes accepted gifts, but not allegiances. Mobility relied on silence. Fighters carried ammunition in baskets of apricots rifles and bundles of firewood instructions in proverbs. Women passed messages by changing scarf colors. Children relayed distances through nursery rhymes. A goat herder's cough echoed a warning across slopes. No one commanded the system, everyone maintained it. Soviet strategists called this leaderless resistance, but that misunderstood the architecture. It wasn't leaderless. It was leaderful redundancy woven through kinship. If one thread snapped, the pattern remained intact. Afghan history had centuries to perfect this tapestry. Empires had only decades. Inside a cramped command tent, Leonov overheard officers debating how to cut off mobility. One suggested blocking mountain passes. Another proposed taxing livestock. A third argued for harsher reprisals. None realized that valleys connect like veins under skin, unpredictable, branching, adaptable. You can't blockade memory. In Nuristan, a commander explained his doctrine to a visiting cousin. The Russians seek heads. We offer only silhouettes. He poured tea, smiled, and added, a net catches fish. But we are water. This mobility shaped the war's tempo. Soviets planned months ahead, scheduling offensives like conferences. Mujahideen planned minutes ahead, adjusting to weather rumor and the rustle of leaves. One approach was brittle, the other elastic. In late autumn, Leonov watched through binoculars as fighters traversed a vertical slope goats would fear. They disappeared behind a ledge, reappeared at a switchback, then slipped into pine shadows. Each footfall seemed placed by instinct. He muttered to himself, "They don't retreat. They obey gravity sideways." His sergeant smirked. "How do you fight water?" The sergeant didn't receive an answer. None existed. The Soviets tried to decapitate a hydra, but every slash merely multiplied its eyes across the ridges. By 1986, the war felt like a wheel turned by ghosts. Soviet battalions patrolled valleys they'd already cleared, passing burnt-out schools and silent irrigation canals. The reports they filed at dusk contradicted what they saw at dawn. Villages pacified last month flew enemy banners this week. Graphs showing progress lay flat on desks in Moscow, while the mountains carved their own statistics into stone: one dead son, 5 avengers. One burned field, 3 cousins with rifles, one helicopter downed a valley singing its name for generations. Gorbachev called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. Each month he applied a new bandage: troop rotations, reconciliation conferences, promises of Afghanization. None closed the wound. The Red Army's enlisted boys, barely old enough to shave, grew hollow-eyed watching friends vanish into scree fields and reappear only as boots carried down the trail by medics. Morale hardened into sarcasm. Soldiers renamed their armored personnel carriers iron coffins and joked that the only way home was inside one. Supply convoys stretched across the ring road like metallic arteries pulsing at the mercy of weather and ambushes. Stinger missiles flickered in the high passes like fireflies with teeth. Helicopter crews smeared soot on their windshields to cut glare and whispered charms before takeoff. They flew low, skimming ridges, terrified of the invisible predator below shoulder-fired judgment. The machine advantage had been clipped. The sky no longer belonged to Moscow. Meanwhile, the Americans didn't need to win. They only needed to feed gravity. Crates crossed the Pakistani border at night, ammunition boots, radios manuals, sometimes nothing more than belief in metal form. Saudi money poured into madrasas where scholars drew battle lines on chalkboards, while Pakistani handlers coached valley militias, like they were assembling a mosaic of proxies. The Cold War crawled down goat paths disguised as sacks of rice. Inside Afghanistan, Najibullah's government clung to checkpoints like sandbags in a river. He offered amnesty, electricity, and slogans. The Mujahideen offered identity revenge and the promise that foreign boots would one day leave dust behind. Afghan army officers defected in batches. It wasn't ideology, it was gravity again. Men fight where honor points, not where pamphlets instruct. In Kabul, families rationed light and bread. They wrapped windows in plastic to soften glass when rockets fell. Children sketched helicopters with wolf fangs in their notebooks. Mothers hung prayer beads from curtain rods like charms against metal. At night, punishing wind rattled shutters, and every house listened, calculating distance by cadence mortar. Rifle. Silence. Scream. Helicopter. Silence. By 1988, Soviet commanders admitted privately what Afghan shepherd boys had known since Winter Mountains Do Not Surrender. Withdrawal began under the choreography of cameras, columns of armor rolling north through the Heritan crossing flags, fluttering for public consumption. Crowds watched with unreadable expressions, some relief, some bitterness, some calculating what came next. The official line was dignity. The unofficial feeling was exhaustion, stitched with disbelief. Colonel Vasiliev, staring from a tank turret as he crossed the Friendship Bridge, mouthed a line he'd scribbled in his notebook. We fought geography, genealogy, and God. We brought none home with us. A conscript beside him wept quietly, not at defeat, but at leaving comrades in fresh soil that smelled faintly of wild thyme. But the war didn't end when engines cooled. Mujahideen groups stared at one another across liberated valleys and whispered old grievances. Without the common enemy, lineages reasserted their teeth. Warlords built fiefdoms around checkpoints and water sources. Pakistan shifted its bets. Foreign volunteers stayed behind, unsure whether to go home or keep sharpening their cause. The vacuum inhaled radicalism like smoke. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself began to collapse, cracks spiderwebbing across maps, statues removed by crane anthems sung out of tune. Some veterans joked that Afghanistan hadn't been Moscow's Vietnam, but its slow avalanche. Others kept quiet, staring at train windows where mountains no longer chased them. In Panjshir, villagers gathered on a ridge and watched dust settle in the empty valley road where convoys once thundered. A mullah murmured, "Even tanks leave footprints. Mountains do not." Children chased goats between boulders shaped like wrecked armor. On a distant peak, a lone fighter stood rifle slung, listening to wind running through cedar trees. He smiled not in triumph, but in recognition that wars aren't won by headlines. They're won by endurance. In Kabul, Najibullah's portrait smiled down from ministry walls until it didn't. In Kandahar, a new group calling themselves Taliban began offering order hard-cold, unyielding. In distant desert camps, foreign veterans practiced new skills with old grudges. The seeds the war planted sprouted in directions no planner could prune. What remained constant was the terrain, steep ridges, narrow passes, villages clinging to rock like moss. And the tactics that had beaten a superpower were now carried in the bones of a generation: ambush, geometry, silence, discipline, patience measured in winters. Mujahideen veterans walked home with nothing but a rifle and a memory of how empires bleed. The last echo of Soviet retreat rolled across the valleys, bounced off frozen scree, and faded into thin air. When it vanished, the mountains were still standing silent and indifferent, holding secrets in their folds like pages no conqueror could ever close. If the Soviet generals had spoken honestly in their memoirs, they would have written a single sentence: "We misread the logic of mountains, because in Afghanistan, terrain is not backdrop, it is doctrine. Villages are fortresses, footpaths are supply lines, family honor is a renewable fuel source." When the Red Army's logistics officers rotated home, Mujahideen quartermasters handed their inventories to their sons. In refugee camps along the Pakistani border, boys memorized lineage between chemistry classes. They learned ambush positions the way other children learn arithmetic. Elders drilled lessons into memory instead of chalkboards. Fight from the sides, not the front. Vanish once your bullet speaks. Carry only what you can run with. These were not tactics, they were inheritance. The Soviets filed everything into categories: armor, air support, ground clearance. The Mujahideen answered with categories just as precise: blood-feud valley, loyalty, prayer hour, winter, hunger. In time, foreign volunteers arrived with their own metrics: martyrdom, spectacle. Afghanistan absorbed them too, like rain into fractured stone. When the Geneva Accords triggered Soviet withdrawal, pundits abroad argued about geopolitics. But in small Afghan villages, veterans gathered at sunset and quietly compared scars. A boy asked his uncle how they'd beaten tanks with rifles. The uncle replied, "We didn't fight the metal. We fought the men inside." Throughout the 1990s, militias splintered along invisible tribal fractures. Checkpoints turned into micro-governments where edicts were enforced by kinship, not constitutions. Ambulances wove around goat herds and minefields, while cities flickered like faulty lanterns, bright one week besieged the next. Afghanistan had become not a graveyard of empires, but a school, and its graduates spread what they learned. In training camps far from cameras, instructors taught ambush geometry. 2 shooters, pin 1 shooter wounds. Gravity does the rest. They demonstrated the shoot, scoot, dissolve pattern against helicopters, fire from the ridge, withdraw before echo fades, reappear in a new silhouette. They held up captured radios and explained a truth the great powers would never print. Communications are vulnerability disguised as strength. Meanwhile, Soviet veterans returned home to cities now called by different names. Their medals tarnished faster than their memories. Some tried to warn the next generation that wars fought on footpaths do not scale to parade formations. Few listened. When the Taliban rose from Kandahar, they carried the discipline of madrasas layered over the muscle memory of guerrilla tactics. They promised order where entropy had ruled. Their black flags erased the colors of warlord banners. In distant deserts, men who once fired at Soviets began planning new targets. The lineage of insurgency mutated, evolved, sharpened. Then in autumn 2001, another foreign army stared into the same mountains, convinced their technology would speak louder. They soon discovered an old truth etched into scree after: the last helicopter leaves the ridgeline remains unchanged. And somewhere in the shadows, an elder traced circle patterns in the dust. With a stick ambush, arcs his grandfather once used against British patrols. Today, documentaries speak of geopolitics and grand strategy, but among the cedar trees, the veterans speak more quietly of patience, silence, and rhythm. They describe war as breath, not thunder. They laugh at analysts who use words like victory, because the Mujahideen never aimed to win by annihilation. They won by duration. In the end, Afghanistan taught 3 eras of superpowers the same lesson: you can measure territory, but you cannot measure resolve. Tanks rust, empires fold, documents fade, But tactics adapted to mountains pass effortlessly from father to son. And when the smoke clears somewhere beneath stone ledges and goat tracks, a single truth remains carved deeper than any victory parade. Wars fought in valleys are decided by those who can sleep in silence on the ridge.